Late on the night of December 17th, 1966, a white Lotus Elan was moving through the residential streets of South Kensington. Behind the wheel was a 21-year-old man. Beside him, a young woman. The roads were quiet, terraced houses, parked cars, the ordinary geometry of a London neighborhood after dark. At the junction of Redcliffe Gardens and Redcliffe Square, another car appeared at the crossroads. The driver swerved, and the passenger would later say he turned the wheel away from her, toward his own side of the car. The Lotus crashed. He was taken to hospital. He did not die that night. He died the next morning, December 18th, while the people who loved him were still waiting for news that had already been decided. His name was Tara Brown. He was the son of one of the wealthiest women in Ireland. And when they brought his body home to be buried, they laid him in the ground at Lugala, the family estate in the Wicklow Mountains, and beside the grave of his half-sister, who had died at 14, and beside the grave of his infant brother, who had never lived long enough to be given a name the public would remember. Tara Brown was not the first person this family buried too young. He was not the second. He was the third child laid to rest on the same grounds, by the same mother, in the span of 23 years. The family name was Guinness, one of the oldest and most visible fortunes in the British and Irish world, and the women at its center had spent decades being photographed, admired, and envied as symbols of everything wealth could buy. What wealth could not buy was the thing they needed most. This is the story of three sisters, Aileen, Maureen, and Oonagh Guinness, who inherited beauty, houses, and a name that opened every door in Europe, and who passed on to their children something far more durable than any of it: grief, instability, and the knowledge that none of it had been enough. But to understand how a 21-year-old ended up buried beside two other dead children on the grounds of his mother's estate in Wicklow, you have to go back further than swinging London, further than the sports cars and the parties and the careless velocity of the 1960s. You have to go back to the family that made him and to the three women at its center. Women the press called the Golden Guinness Girls. Women who were born into one of the most recognizable fortunes in the British and Irish world and spent the rest of their lives discovering, in different ways and at different speeds, what that fortune could not do. This is the story of Aileen, Maureen, and Oonagh Guinness. Three sisters, three marriages apiece, three grand houses, and a pattern of loss so relentless that people who watched it unfold from the outside began calling it a curse. The people living inside it did not need a word for it. They already knew what it was. The name itself carried a particular kind of weight. Guinness was not new money. It was not Hollywood money or stock market money or the kind of American fortune that announced itself with yachts and tabloid romances. Guinness was brewing money, which meant it was old, industrial, and embedded in the social architecture of both Britain and Ireland, in a way that made the family seem less like millionaires and more like a permanent feature of the landscape. The dynasty began with Arthur Guinness in 1759, when he signed a 9,000-year lease on a brewery at St. James's Gate in Dublin. A lease so absurdly long it might as well have been a declaration of intent to outlast time itself. By the late 19th century, the brewery was the largest in the world, and the family had translated that commercial dominance into something the British establishment understood even better than profit: title and land. Their grandfather, Edward Guinness, had been created the first Earl of Evia. Their father, Ernest Guinness, was a chairman of the brewery and a man whose resources were so vast that when his daughters married, he simply bought them houses. Not houses, estates, castles, properties large enough to contain entire worlds and, as it would turn out, to conceal entire disasters. Their mother, Marie Clotilde Russell, known as Chloe, was the daughter of the Baron de Gunzburg and brought her own continental elegance to the household. The marriage between Ernest and Chloe produced three daughters and placed them at the intersection of Anglo-Irish aristocracy and European social glamour. A position that meant the girls were raised to be looked at, to be admired, and to understand that their primary value to the world they inhabited was ornamental. That is not a judgment. That is the operating logic of their class and their era, and it shaped everything that followed. Aileen Sibel, Mary Guinness was the eldest, born in 1904. Maureen Constance Guinness followed in 1907. Oonagh, the youngest, arrived in 1910. They grew up at Glenmaroon, the family estate in Chapelizode near Dublin, inside a childhood defined not by what they earned or discovered, but by what surrounded them: staff, gardens, social expectation, and the absolute certainty that money was not something you pursued. It was something you breathed. Ernest was not a demonstrative father in the way modern audiences might expect. He was a man of his class and generation, powerful, distant, generous with property, and largely absent from the emotional interiors of his children's lives. He provided everything that could be purchased. What could not be purchased, he did not appear to notice was missing. In 1923, Ernest sent all three daughters on a world tour aboard his private yacht, the Phantom II. Aileen was 19, Maureen was 16, Oonagh was 13. That single detail tells you almost everything you need to know about the scale of their upbringing and the distance it created between these women and the ordinary texture of human life. They sailed the world before they had finished growing up, and the vessel they sailed on belonged to their father, and no part of the journey required them to reckon with limitation of any kind. The world came to them, curated and controlled, and the lesson it taught was that boundaries were things that applied to other people. By the time they were introduced to London society in the late 1920s, the press had already decided what they were. Three blonde sisters, all of them beautiful, all of them photographed in the clothes and settings that confirm interwar glamour at its most polished. The Golden Guinness Girls. It was a phrase designed to sell newspapers, but it also captured something real about the way these women moved through the world. They were a trio. They were decorative in the way that era demanded of wealthy young women. And they were marriageable on a scale that made their every romantic decision a matter of public fascination. When they entered a room together, people noticed. When they appeared in the society pages, people talked. The Guinness sisters were not simply rich young women. They were, for a particular slice of British and Irish society, a kind of living spectacle, proof that enough money and enough beauty could produce something that looked from the outside like perfection. What the photographs could not show, and what the society columns never explored, was what each of these women actually wanted. Aileen, the eldest, appears in the historical record as someone drawn to beauty, order, and continuity, a woman who wanted the successful aristocratic household, the estate kept perfectly, the life arranged with taste and sustained with permanence. She was the most conventional of the three in her ambitions, which does not mean she was the least interesting. It means she believed most fully in the promise her upbringing had made, that if you did everything right, married well, kept house beautifully, maintained appearances with discipline and grace, the structure would hold. That belief would cost her decades. Maureen was sharper, more socially forceful, more obviously brilliant, and more dangerous to underestimate. She wanted influence, and she wanted to be seen, and she had the intelligence and the will to get both. Where Aileen sought permanence, Maureen sought power. Not political power in the formal sense, but the social power that came from being the most formidable person in any room she entered. She was witty, she was ruthless in conversation. She could charm anyone she chose to charm and freeze anyone she chose to dismiss. People who knew her described a woman of extraordinary force, the kind of person who made you feel that the atmosphere in a room changed when she arrived. Oonagh, the youngest, was the most elusive and perhaps the most emotionally ambitious. What she seems to have wanted was not merely status, but atmosphere, devotion, artistic feeling, a world she could shape into something enchanted. She wanted, in a sense, to live inside beauty. Not the managed beauty of Aileen's castle or the social beauty of Maureen's drawing room, but something more fragile and more personal. A life that felt like a work of art, a household that existed on feeling rather than structure, and she would spend the rest of her life learning how little beauty could protect. Each sister married for the first time before she was 30, and in each case, Ernest Guinness ensured that the marriage came furnished. When Aileen married the Honorable Brinsley Sheridan Plunkett in 1927, Ernest bought her Luttrellstown Castle, a Gothic revival estate near Dublin set on over 500 acres, with grounds large enough to disappear into and a house grand enough to spend a lifetime perfecting. It was the kind of gift that only a man of Ernest's wealth could give casually, and it tells you something about the family's relationship with property. Houses were not investments or accomplishments. They were accessories to marriage, purchased the way other fathers might purchase a set of china. When Maureen married Basil Hamilton Temple Blackwood in 1930, she entered a family that already owned Clandeboy, the vast estate in County Down that had been the seat of the Dufferin line for generations. The property was magnificent and the title was ancient, though the financial reality of that inheritance would prove far less stable than its acreage suggested. That gap between appearance and solvency would define Maureen's adult life in a way she could not yet have imagined on her wedding day. When Oonagh married Philip Kindersley in 1929 and later divorced him and married Dominic Brown, the fourth Baron, Oranmore, and Brown. In 1936, Ernest gave her Lugala, the Wicklow hunting lodge nestled beneath the granite shoulders of Fancy Mountain, looking out over Loftay in a valley so dramatic that it seemed designed to make anyone standing in it feel that the ordinary world had been left behind. Lugala would become the most mythologized of the three estates and the one most inseparable from the woman who lived in it. Where Luttrellstown was Aileen's project and Clandeboye was Maureen's responsibility, Lugala was Unu's identity. She did not merely live there, she became it. 3 sisters, 3 estates, 3 marriages arranged with the confidence that enough money, enough property, and enough social standing could guarantee the kind of life that looked from any distance like a fairy tale made solid. That confidence would not survive the next 2 decades. But before it broke, it produced something worth understanding. Not because the glamour was false, but because it was real enough that its destruction carried weight. Aileen poured herself into Luttrellstown with the discipline of someone who believed that if the house was beautiful enough, the life inside it would follow. She redesigned interiors, curated gardens, and became known as one of the finest hostesses in Anglo-Irish society. Visitors to Luttrellstown in the 1930s described a world of immaculate taste, rooms arranged with the precision of someone who understood that elegance was not inherited but built, day after day, choice after choice. Aileen was not performing wealth. She was constructing something she believed in, a household that worked, a marriage that endured, a life that made sense. For a time, it did. She and Brinsley had children, the castle filled with guests. The tables were set and the gardens were tended, and the photographs from those years show a woman who looked, by every external measure, like someone who had gotten exactly what she wanted. What the photographs do not show is whether she had. Maureen's trajectory was more dramatic and arrived faster. She and Basil married in 1930, and while they were still on their honeymoon, Basil's father died. Overnight, Basil became the 4th Marquess of Dufferin and Ava, and Maureen became a Marchioness. She was 23 years old. Clandeboy was suddenly hers to manage, and with it came not only the title and the land, but the discovery that the estate was carrying significant debt. The kind of debt that aristocratic families accrued across generations and maintained through a combination of denial, credit, and the assumption that the land itself would always be worth more than what was owed against it. Maureen responded not by retreating, but by accelerating. She threw herself into London society with a force that made her one of the most talked about women of the 1930s. She hosted, she charmed, she performed the role of Marchioness with such conviction that outsiders assumed the life behind it was as effortless as it looked. She and Basil had 3 children, Perdita, Caroline, and Sheridan. The family portrait was complete. And yet, even at the height of it, there were signals that the emotional reality inside Clandeboy was not what the guest list suggested. Years later, Caroline Blackwood, who would become one of the most celebrated and most troubled writers of her generation, said that her childhood was too painful to recount. That sentence deserves to sit on its own for a moment, not because it is dramatic, but because of what it refuses to give. She did not describe the pain. She did not name it. She said it was too much to revisit, and in that refusal, she told you everything about what those beautiful rooms actually contain. Perdita, her sister, said that Maureen preferred talking about her glory days in London society to engaging with the emotional lives of her children. Those statements reveal something about what was actually being transmitted inside these grand houses. Not warmth, not security, not the kind of sustained parental attention that children need in order to feel seen. What was being transmitted was style, expectation, and the understanding that appearance mattered more than feeling. The children absorbed that lesson. They would carry it for the rest of their lives. Oonagh, meanwhile, was building something different at Lugala, where Aileen constructed order and Maureen projected power. Oonagh created atmosphere. Lugala, under her care, became a place people described in enchanted terms. A house where artists, writers, aristocrats, and wanderers gathered in the Wicklow Mountains and felt for a night or a weekend that they had stepped outside the ordinary world and into something luminous and rare. Brendan Behan drank there. The painters came. The musicians played late into the evenings. Oonagh was the hostess, the presiding spirit, the woman whose beauty and warmth made the whole enterprise feel not like a party, but like a private civilization. She wanted Lugala to be magical, and by many accounts it was. The trouble with magic, of course, is that it depends on the magician never breaking, and Oonagh was more fragile than anyone watching the performance could see. But the magic had a cost that was becoming visible even during the best years. Oonagh's first marriage to Philip Kindersley ended in 1936. Her second marriage to Dominic Brown began with the gift of Lugala and the promise of a life rooted in place and family, but the relationship frayed. They had children, Gareth and Tara, and the household that looked from the outside like an Irish Eden was already showing the strain of two people who could not sustain the emotional world they had built together. The marriage that was supposed to anchor Lugala's domestic life became instead another source of instability. By 1950, that marriage too was over. Oonagh was 40 years old and twice divorced. And beneath the divorces, beneath the social performances and the beautiful rooms, the losses had already started. In 1943, Oonagh's infant son from her marriage to Dominic Brown died. He had barely lived. The details of his death are thin in the public record, which is perhaps its own kind of testament to how families like this handled grief, privately, quietly, behind walls thick enough to muffle any sound that might disturb the image. 3 years later, in 1946, her daughter Teresa, from her first marriage, died at just 14 years old, a child, gone before she had the chance to become whoever she might have been. 2 children dead before Oonagh was 40. The grounds of Lugala, that enchanted estate in the Wicklow Valley, began to accumulate graves. The guests still came, the parties still happened, and somewhere beneath the laughter and the music, there were 2 small headstones that the guests walked past without knowing what they meant to the woman who had put them there. The pattern was not confined to Oonagh. In 1940, Aileen and Brinsley divorced, ending the marriage that had anchored Luttrellstown's domestic life for 13 years. The castle remained. The interiors she had curated remained. The gardens she had shaped remained. The marriage did not. 1 year later, in 1941, Brinsley was killed during the war. The man she had married, the father of her children, the person around whom the castle had been organized, gone first by separation and then by death in the space of 12 months. Aileen was 37 years old. She was a divorced woman living in a castle bought by her father to celebrate a marriage that no longer existed, and the man she had divorced was now dead. The architecture of her life stood intact. Its emotional purpose had been destroyed. Maureen's fracture arrived in 1945. Basil, the 4th Marquess, was killed in Burma during the final months of the war. He was 35. Maureen was left a widow at 38, with 3 children under the age of 15 and an estate that was not only emotionally shattered but financially precarious. Clandeboy was mortgaged. The debts Basil had inherited and failed to resolve were now entirely hers to manage. The title that had arrived so suddenly on a honeymoon now carried the full weight of its obligations, and the man who was supposed to carry it was dead in a country thousands of miles from the house that bore his name. Maureen was, in that moment, a young widow, a mother, and the sole custodian of a legacy that was eating itself from the inside. What she did next would define her for the rest of her life. By the mid-1940s, all 3 sisters had lost either a husband or a marriage or a child, and in most cases more than one. The public still saw the photographs, the houses, the name, the Golden Guinness Girls. But behind that name, the architecture was failing. Aileen's castle stood intact while its domestic center had collapsed. Maureen's title survived while its financial and emotional foundation buckled beneath her. Oonagh's enchanted house now held the memory of 2 dead children and a marriage that could not be saved. There is a phrase people began to use, this the Guinness Curse. It is the kind of phrase that flattens complexity into superstition. It takes a pattern of grief stretching across decades and packages it as something almost entertaining, something that belongs on a magazine cover rather than in a human life. But the pattern was real, even if the word was wrong. What was happening to this family was not supernatural. It was the collision between enormous privilege and ordinary human fragility, played out across decades in houses large enough to contain the damage without anyone outside having to see it. The walls were thick, the grounds were vast, the grief stayed indoors, and the damage was not finished. It was moving downward now, from the generation that had built those worlds to the generation that had grown up inside them. Maureen's daughter, Caroline, who would one day write with devastating precision about wealth and emotional ruin, was already absorbing the lessons of Clondeboy, learning what it meant to be the child of a woman who could manage an estate and command a dinner table, but could not or would not turn that same attention toward the people who needed her most. Una's surviving sons, Garrick and Tara, were growing up at Lugala in the shadow of siblings who had not survived, in a household run by a woman whose beauty and warmth the world celebrated, but whose private grief was something she carried alone behind the performance. The children were watching. They were learning what this family did to its own. By the early 1960s, one of those children had become a young man, moving through London with the kind of velocity that comes from having been given everything except the one thing that might have slowed him down. Tara Brown was 21 years old. He won. He was beautiful, reckless, and adored. He was Una's son. And the family that had already buried two of his siblings was about to learn that the pattern had not ended. It had only been waiting. Tara Brown moved through the 1960s the way only a certain kind of young man could, with money he had not earned, beauty he had not asked for, and a confidence that came not from accomplishment, but from never having been told no. He was Una's youngest son by Dominic Brown, born on March 4th, 1945, and by the time he reached his late teens, he had become a fixture of the London scene that would later be remembered as swinging London, though at the time it was simply the world he inhabited. He knew the Beatles, he knew the Stones. He drove fast cars and attended the right parties and was photographed in the right places with the right people, and none of it required effort because effort was not something his life had ever demanded. He was, by every visible measure, a young man for whom the future was not a question, but an assumption. He had married young, Noreen McSherry, when he was just 18, and they had two sons. That detail is easy to miss inside the mythology of the swinging London golden boy, but it matters. Tara was not merely a young man about town. He was a husband and a father before he was 20. The marriage itself followed a pattern the Guinness family might have recognized if they had been inclined to look at their own history honestly. Early, impulsive, conducted with the certainty that love and money together would be enough to make anything work. By the time of his death, the marriage had already fractured. The two sons, small children, too young to understand what was happening, would become the subject of a custody battle that proved the damage did not end when the car stopped moving. But the life that produced Tara was not the glittering inheritance it appeared to be. He had grown up at Lugala, which meant he had grown up in a house where beauty and grief occupied the same rooms. His half-sister Teresa had died before he was old enough to understand what death meant. His infant brother had died before Tara could have known him at all. His parents' marriage had ended when he was 5 years old, which meant that his earliest memories of home included the knowledge, absorbed perhaps rather than explained, that the people who were supposed to stay together did not. His mother had remarried and would divorce again. The estate that the world saw as enchanted was, for the children who actually lived there, a place where loss was part of the landscape. Literally, given that the graves were on the grounds. You could walk from the house to the lake and past the place where two children were buried, and the beauty of the walk did not change the fact of what lay beneath the soil. Tara did not talk about any of this publicly, or if he did, the record does not preserve it. What the record preserves instead is the image, the golden boy, the heir, the young aristocrat racing through London as if speed itself were a kind of freedom. And perhaps it was. Perhaps speed was the only thing that kept the stillness from catching up. While Tara was building his brief legend in London, his aunts were contending with the longer, slower consequences of the lives they had constructed. Aileen, the eldest, remarried in 1956, this time to the designer Valerian Stux Ribar, a man of style and European sophistication whose company she enjoyed, but whose temperament, it would emerge, was no more compatible with hers than Brinsley's had been. That marriage ended in divorce in 1965, making it Aileen's second failed marriage and confirming a pattern she must have recognized even if she never named it publicly. Two marriages, two endings, and a castle that had witnessed both. Luttrell's town still stood, still beautiful, still a monument to the taste and discipline she had poured into it for nearly 4 decades. But the economics of maintaining a property on that scale were shifting in the ways that taste and discipline could not address. Ernest Guinness's death had triggered punishing death duties, and the fortune that had once seemed inexhaustible was being carved away by taxes, legal obligations, and the simple mathematics of living as though money were infinite when it was merely vast. The rooms that Aileen had spent years perfecting now required the kind of upkeep that consumed capital rather than reflecting it. There's something particularly cruel about watching a person's life's work become a trap. Aileen had poured decades into Luttrell's town, every room curated, every garden shaped, every detail chosen with the seriousness of someone who believed that beauty, properly maintained, could hold a life together. And now the maintenance itself was the problem. The estate that had been her identity was becoming her burden. She would hold on to Luttrell's town until 1983, nearly 6 decades after her father had purchased it, but the trajectory was already visible by the mid-1960s. The fairy tale Ernest had bought for her in 1927 was revealing itself, slowly and without drama, to be a structure she could neither afford to maintain nor bear to leave. That is a particular kind of prison, one with 500 acres and a Gothic revival facade, where the warden is not a person, but a set of obligations that no amount of elegance can satisfy. Maureen's life after Basil's death had taken a different shape, harder, more managerial, and in its own way more impressive, though the emotional cost was steep and the people who paid it most were not always the ones making the decisions. She had remarried twice. First Major Desmond Buchanan in 1948, a marriage that ended in divorce in 1954, and then Judge John Maud in 1955, though by many accounts they lived largely apart. Maureen's romantic life followed a pattern that was distinct from her sister's in tone but not in outcome. Men entered her orbit, were dazzled or dominated, and eventually departed. 3 marriages for each of the 3 sisters. 9 marriages across the trio, and not one of them held. That statistic alone tells a story, though the story it tells is not about bad luck. It is about a generation of women who were raised to marry well and given no instruction whatsoever on how to live with the person they married. What Maureen did, with remarkable effectiveness in the decades after Basil's death, was rescue Clundaboy. After his death left the estate buried in debt, she bought it herself for £192,000 and reorganized it through an estate company, ensuring that the property her children might otherwise have lost would survive. It was an act of financial intelligence and dynastic determination that deserves recognition because it tells you something true about who Maureen was, a woman who could save a house even when she could not save the people inside it. She sat on the Guinness Brewery board after Ernest's death, one of the few women of her era to occupy that kind of institutional position. She raised significant funds for the Hoarder Center for Arthritis. She remained, well into her later decades, a figure of social force and institutional competence, the kind of woman people described as magnificent and meant it as both compliment and warning. But the children who grew up under that competence told a different story. And it is their story that reveals what Maureen's public achievements actually cost. Caroline Blackwood's writing would return again and again to themes of emotional coldness, aristocratic performance, and the particular cruelty of being raised by someone who was brilliant at everything except tenderness. Caroline's own life would become its own kind of evidence. She married Lucian Freud, and that marriage failed. She married the composer Israel Sitkowitz, and that marriage failed. She married the poet Robert Lowell, and that marriage ended with his death in 1977, in the back of a taxi from the airport, holding a Freud portrait of Caroline under his arm. The detail is almost too literary to be true. But it was true, and it tells you something about the kind of lives these families produced. Lives that generated the raw material for art and destroyed the people supplying it. Carolyn wrote with painful brilliance about precisely the world that had raised her, and the brilliance did not protect her from the instability she had inherited. Perdita spoke of a mother who preferred reminiscing about London society to reckoning with the emotional needs of her own family. Maureen's son, Sheridan, the fifth Marquis of Dufferin and Ava, the heir to the title she had fought to preserve, would die before his mother. One more loss in a family that seemed unable to stop accumulating them. The inheritance that Maureen fought so hard to maintain in bricks and acreage and institutional influence was being lost in the only currency that actually mattered, the well-being of the people who carried the name. Oonagh, meanwhile, had married for the third time in 1957 to Miguel Ferreras and divorced him in 1965. 3 marriages, 3 endings. The biographical fact is simple enough to state in a single sentence. The human reality behind it is not. Each marriage represented an attempt to build or rebuild the emotional center of her life, and each failure left her more tightly bound to the one thing that had not left her, Lugala. The house did not divorce her. The house did not die. The house remained and Oonagh remained inside it, and the relationship between the woman and the estate deepened into something that looked, from certain angles, less like ownership and more like mutual dependency. The estate's cultural reputation continued to grow even as the family inside it contracted. Artists and writers still came. The fireplaces still burned. The mountains still ringed the valley like a wall against the ordinary world. Gareth, her elder surviving son, was becoming a serious figure in Irish cultural life, devoted to the preservation of traditional music through his founding of Clatter Records and to the heritage of the estate itself. He took seriously what Oonagh had created at Lugala and began to shape it into something that would outlast her. A cultural institution rather than merely a private retreat. But Tara, her younger son, was in London, moving fast, too fast. And Oonagh, who had already learned twice what it meant to bury a child, could not have known that the lesson was not finished. There is something about that period, the early and middle 1960s, that deserves attention because it reveals how completely the public image and the private reality had separated. The press still treated the Guinness name as shorthand for glamour. Lugala still appeared in social columns as a place of magic and artistic retreat. The sisters, now in their 50s and 60s, were still photographed, still referenced, still part of the mythology of Anglo-Irish wealth that the public consumed the way it consumed any other luxury product, from a distance, with admiration, and without any interest in what it cost. But the actual substance of their lives, the divorces, the bereavements, the financial erosions, the children who had been raised inside beautiful houses and emerged with the wounds they would spend decades trying to articulate. None of that made the photographs. The image held. The people behind it did not. And then, on a December night in London, the image shattered in a way that could not be repaired. On the evening of December 17, 1966, Tara Brown was driving through South Kensington. He was in his Lotus Elan, a small, fast car that suited him. Lightweight, elegant, built for speed rather than safety. It was the kind of car a young man with money drove, not because he needed to get anywhere, but because the act of driving it felt like an expression of who he was. Beside him was Suki Potier, a model. The streets were dark and ordinary, the kind of London night that holds no particular drama, no warning, no sense that anything is about to change. They had been out for the evening. They were driving through the kind of residential streets that thousands of people drove through every night without consequence. Nothing about the evening, as far as the record shows, was unusual. Nothing was dramatic. Nothing announced itself as the last night of anyone's life. They reached the junction of Redcliffe Gardens and Redcliffe Square. It was a crossroads like any other in South Kensington. Terraced houses, parked cars, the quiet geometry of a London residential neighborhood at night. A white car appeared at the junction. What happened next took seconds. In the fraction of a moment that separated one version of the future from another, Tara swerved. The instinct, if Potier's later testimony is accurate, was not self-preservation. It was the opposite. He turned the wheel away from the passenger seat, away from her. Potier later told the inquest that she believed he had swerved to save her life. The car crashed. The junction that had been an ordinary piece of London geography became the place where Oonagh Guinness's youngest surviving son was fatally injured. Tara did not die immediately. That detail matters because it means there was time. Time for a hospital, time for phone calls, time for people who loved him to arrive and sit and wait and hope, and then to learn that the hope was not enough. He died the next day, December 18th, 1966. He was 21 years old. There is a temptation with a death like this to reach for the language of mythology. The golden boy cut down, the prince of swinging London extinguished in a blaze of youth and speed. The documentary should resist that temptation entirely, because the mythology is a lie designed to make the death feel meaningful in the way stories are meaningful. And this was not a story. This was a car crash at a residential junction. What happened was smaller and more terrible than any mythology. A young man was driving through a city at night. Another car appeared. He turned the wheel, and then he was gone. The mechanics of it were ordinary. A junction, a swerve, a collision. The aftermath was ordinary too, in the worst possible way. A hospital, a vigil, a death the following day, and then the phone calls that would carry the news outward to the people who loved him and to the people who would turn his death into something they could use. Oonagh received the news that her son was dead. She was 56 years old. She had already buried a daughter and an infant son. She already knew what it meant to stand at a graveside on the grounds of Lugala and watch a child lowered into the earth. She had done it twice before. The ritual was not new to her. The grief was not new to her. Only the name was new. Only the specific, irreplaceable person was new. And now she would do it again. For the third time, a mother would bury a child in the grounds of her own home. And for the third time, the world would go on treating that home as a place of enchantment. Tora's body was brought back to Ireland and buried at Lugala. The grave was near those of his half-sister Teresa, who had died at 14, and his infant brother, who had never had a name the public record preserved. 3 children, buried on the same estate, within the span of 23 years. The enchanted house in the Wicklow Valley, the place Oonagh had tried to make into something beautiful enough to hold against the world, had become a private cemetery. The grounds that guests described in rapturous terms, the landscape that artists painted and writers celebrated, now contained 3 graves belonging to 3 of Oonagh's children. That is not a metaphor. That is a geography of grief made literal. You could stand at Lugala and look out over Lofte and see one of the most beautiful views in Ireland, and beneath your feet, or near enough, were the remains of 3 people who had been loved and lost by the same woman, in the same house, across the span of a quarter century. The view did not change. The mountains did not move. The water remained. And the graves remained too, long after the parties had ended and the last guests had gone home. The inquest returned a verdict of accidental death. Potier's testimony, that Tara had swerved, that he had likely saved her life at the cost of his own, became part of the official record and part of the story the family carried afterward. There was no scandal, no mystery, no suggestion of anything other than a young man driving too fast on a London night and encountering the kind of ordinary hazard that ordinary people survive every day. The difference was that this ordinary hazard killed him, and the family he left behind was already so saturated with loss that his death did not arrive as a single catastrophe. It arrived as confirmation. It arrived as the latest evidence that this family's wealth, beauty, and social standing could not protect the people carrying them from the simplest and most devastating of human experiences. A child died, a mother grieved, and no amount of money could change a single fact about either. In the weeks and months that followed, the tragedy extended into a legal fight that proved the damage had not finished arriving. Tara had 2 young sons from his marriage to Maureen McSherry, and the question of who would raise them became a matter of public dispute. Oonagh sought custody and eventually prevailed, bringing the boys to Lugala, bringing them, in other words, to the estate where their father was buried, where their grandmother presided over a household that had become as much memorial as home. There is something both touching and unsettling about that arrangement. Oonagh wanted the boys close. She wanted to give them what she had given Tara, the beauty of Lugala, the warmth of her attention, the feeling of being inside something rare. But the estate those boys entered was also the place where their father's body lay in the ground alongside two other children who had not survived their connection to this family. The custody battle mattered because it proved what dynasty stories always prove: that death does not end the disruption, it transfers it. The adults fight over the children absorb the fighting. The next generation inherits not money or property, but the unresolved grief of the generation before. The pattern continues because no one knows how to stop it, and because stopping it would require looking directly at the damage, which is the one thing families like this have never been trained to do. Aileen and Maureen, by the time of Tara's death, were women in their 60s who had already lived through widowhood, divorce, financial decline, and the death of people they loved. They stood as witnesses to what this family had become. Not three golden girls sailing the world on their father's yacht, but three aging women who had learned, separately and together, that the Guinness name could purchase property and prestige and the appearance of permanence, but could not purchase the one thing they had each, in different ways, most needed: safety for the people they loved. That was the inheritance they had actually received. Not money, not beauty, not houses. The knowledge that none of it was enough. The cultural afterlife of Tara's death arrived quickly and from an unexpected direction. When John Lennon read the newspaper report of the crash, the details lodged in his mind, and elements of the story appeared in A Day in the Life, the song that would close the Beatles' 1967 album. The connection between Tara Brown and the song has been discussed and debated for decades, and it gave his death a kind of public immortality that no one in his family had asked for and that served the purposes of pop culture rather than the purposes of grief. Millions of people have heard that song without knowing whose death it describes. They hear the melody and the orchestral crescendo and the final crashing chord, and they feel something, and what they feel has nothing to do with Oonagh Guinness, standing at a graveside in Wicklow for the third time. The song is cultural memory, not emotional truth. It belongs to the history of popular music. It does not belong to the family that lived it. The sisters' later lives should be understood not as epilogues, but as the final evidence of what this story was always about. Oonagh remained at Lugala after Tara's death, the presiding spirit of a house that had become synonymous with her. Its beauty, its sorrow, its stubborn refusal to let go of either. She continued to host. She continued to be photographed. She continued in the way that women of her generation and class were trained to do, to appear. But the woman behind the appearance was someone who had survived 3 failed marriages and the deaths of 3 children, and who had chosen to go on living in the house where those children were buried. That choice is not easily understood from the outside. It may have been devotion to the place, to the memory, to the idea that leaving would mean abandoning not just a house but the people beneath its soil. It may have been an inability to separate herself from the place where her grief lived, because grief, when it has been lived with long enough, becomes a kind of companion, and leaving it behind can feel like leaving behind the last connection to the people who caused it. It may have been both. Oonagh died at Lugala in 1995. She was 85 years old. She died in the house her father had given her 60 years earlier, in the valley where 3 of her children were buried, in the place the world still called Enchanted. Maureen survived into 1998, still formidable, still socially present, still the Marchioness. But her final years were marked by a legal dispute that laid bare the emotional fractures the family had spent decades covering with good manners and thick walls. When she arranged for roughly £50 million to pass directly to her grandchildren, her daughters and daughter-in-law challenged the decision in court. The case was, on its surface, about money. Beneath the surface, it was about something older and more painful: who had been loved, who had been seen, who had been chosen. The daughters who had described their childhood as emotionally barren were now contesting their mother's final act of control, and the courtroom became one more setting in which this family performed its private agony in public. The money was real. The grievance was older than the money. Maureen died at 91. Her son Sheridan, the 5th Marquess of Dufferin and Ava, had predeceased her, dead before his mother, carrying the title she had fought to preserve into a grave that arrived before hers. In 2021, Maureen appeared as a character in the BBC series A Very British Scandal, played by Julia Davis. One more iteration of the Guinness name filtered through dramatization, One more version of the story that emphasized the surface and simplified what lay beneath. Aileen outlived both her sisters. She had sold Luttrellstown in 1983, ending more than 50 years of connection to the castle Ernest had bought her as a wedding gift. The sale was not dramatic. It was the quiet conclusion of a financial reality that had been tightening for decades. Death duties, maintenance costs, the slow erosion of a fortune that had once seemed beyond erosion. The castle she had spent her life perfecting became someone else's property, and the woman who had shaped its every room retreated into smaller settings, far from the Gothic revival grandeur that had defined her public identity for more than half a century. Her daughter Nelia died in 1992, one more loss absorbed quietly by a woman who had spent a lifetime absorbing them. Aileen died in 1999. She was 95 years old. She had outlasted her sisters, her husbands, and the castle that was supposed to be her legacy. She had outlasted, in a sense, the world that had made her. Three sisters who had entered public life as a single, glittering image, blonde, wealthy, photographed, envied, ended as three separate survivors of three different kinds of wreckage. Oonagh buried at Lugala, the estate she had loved, into a mausoleum. Maureen outliving her own son, her fortune contested by the family she had tried to command. Aileen retreating from the castle that had been her life's project, dying quietly after selling the last physical evidence of what she had built. Each of them had tried in her own way to make the Guinness inheritance work, to turn the money and the name and the property into something that resembled a life. Each of them discovered that the inheritance contained its own destruction. Garrick Brown, Oonagh's elder surviving son, carried the legacy of Lugala forward with seriousness and dedication, becoming an important patron of Irish traditional music and culture through Claddagh records and his stewardship of the estate that had defined his mother's life and his own. He died in 2018 at the age of 78. Clandeboy remained tied to the Dufferin line. Luttrellstown survived as a historic estate and event venue, beautiful and available to anyone willing to pay. Its connection to the woman who had shaped it fading with each passing year and each new set of guests who walked its rooms without knowing her name. The houses lasted. The name endured. The women who had animated both are remembered now in fragments, a photograph in a society archive, a title on a family tree, an anecdote repeated at a dinner party, a tragedy referenced in a song most people have heard without knowing whose death it describes. What the story of the Guinness sisters reveals is not that wealth causes suffering or that a curse was real in any literal sense. It is something quieter and more difficult to dismiss. Money preserved the buildings, the names, the appearances, and the social architecture long after it had failed to preserve the people living inside them. Aileen, Maureen, and Oonagh inherited beauty, rank, and houses large enough to look permanent. What they passed on, just as powerfully, were grief, instability, and the emotional consequences of lives lived too publicly and felt too privately. There is no neat moral in that. There is only the image of one Wicklow estate, still beautiful after all these years, with 3 children buried by the water. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe for more stories like this.